My name is Karen Hutt. I am a minister with First Universalist, and I have never been so proud to be a UU. It's been 25 years this year for me in ministry, and I am grateful to be with all of you. I was born with a heart defect. Doctors were uncertain if they could do such a risky surgery, and a very costly surgery on this little colored girl in 1959. They debated, my parents challenged the hospital, and 2 years later, my life was saved through the surgery. But following my surgery, it was in a largely African-American hospital. They moved that procedure out of the city, making it really inaccessible for Black families. There's no justice. There's no peace. When I was a kid, my great-grandfather, who was born just after the Emancipation Proclamation, told me about his mother who had been enslaved. His mom was a seamstress who freed herself. She needed work, and she got a job sewing Confederate flags during the Civil War. She used the money to buy her relatives out of slavery. Her husband, though, we learned very little about, was murdered by white children for fun. The story goes that they took out his eyeballs for marbles. There's no justice. There's no peace. When I was a kid, my grandfather told me about how proud he was to be a soldier during World War I. He loved the uniform because the women in France thought that he was just the most handsome Negro ever. When he and his best friends came home from the war to Delaware, Maryland area, they were chased by a gang of white men. They caught my Pup-Pup's friend and lynched him. The Pup-Pup hid in some debris until it was safe to escape. At the lynching, hundreds of white adults and children took pictures with his friend's charred body, smiling. And then chunks of his body was distributed to the many that sought them to put in what was called a nigger jar. There was no justice, and there was no peace. When I was a teenager, I was a popular, mischievous, smart aleck kid who took lots of risks with the boys. We sat on the chains between the subway cars in Philadelphia, sitting on them while the train was moving 80 miles an hour underground. We jumped on the back of public city buses and held onto the ledge to ride to the next stop. We asked adults to buy us Boone's Farm apple wine at the state store. And the cops would always come on these incidents, and I couldn't run very fast, so I always hid underneath the cars. All the boys were eventually arrested or beaten, at least once by the police in their early years, and many, many, many went to juvie. There is no justice. There is no peace. When I was a young adult, I took a boat to work on an island in the Boston Harbor with Black and white kids from South Boston High School. We were teaching them leadership skills using the ropes course and environmental science as a metaphor so that they could go back into their school during the height of racial violence during the busing crisis in Boston in the early 80s. One day, I had to take the late boat back to Dorchester Bay and walk a mile to the Red Line train station. On the way, I was jumped by a gang of whites. I was left semi-conscious on the ground after a brief but painful encounter. There's no justice, and there's no peace. When I was 30, in my 30s, I moved to Chicago, the most segregated city in America. One day I was driving and was pulled over by the police. One day I was driving and pulled over by the police. One day I was driving and pulled over by the police, but a matter of 15 times in 1 year. I was ticketed, harassed, disrespected. There's no justice. There's no peace. When I was in my 40s, I worked at a maximum security prison with thousands of Black men, piled like sardines, 7 floors high. I watched guards step on the heads of these men and then drag them down concrete staircases in races on either side of the tier for entertainment. There was no justice and there was no peace. Now, in my 60s, I see my country much the way I see this so-called president, both behaving like insolent children, a ravenous toddler, unable and uninterested in controlling or mitigating raw, historical, racist impulses to conquer and destroy Black life. These eruptions against our humanity can happen at any time and at any place because anti-Blackness and white supremacy are the bedrock of this nation. The slightest tremor can shake the ground beneath our feet, and then that foot of gleeful control steps on our collective necks. This country who hears my pain as white noise, who sees my blood as inconvenient puddles to step over. This country has weathered my Black body with stress and illness. This country whose structures and machinery of injustice continue to create new ways to separate my head from my body. You see, America loves our Black bodies. To throw a ball on a field, to dunk a hoop, to labor in the industries of capital, for sexual fantasies, and the provision of entertainment. But our Black heads, not so much. Our heads that create Black towns after slavery, our heads that innovate and invent, our heads that do complex math, our heads that write novels, our heads who create music and smile and joke with generativity despite the terror, our heads that have figured out how to survive and how to take care of ourselves, our dignified heads that are held high, and most of all, our heads that speak truth to power. For the American anti-Black movement, it is that head of George Floyd, his head with kinky hair, his head with a broad African nose, his head with beautiful full lips, his head with dark brown skin. It is that head that the anti-Black agenda seeks to sever from its body. So white supremacy can feed. You must cut off that head so it can feed on him like zombies feed on brains. The killer cop that kneeled on George Floyd's neck lingered with childish glee. Look at his face. And he's lingering with institutional sanction, thinking that this was okay, that this was acceptable to do. He looks bewildered at all the fuss as he casually keeps his hand in his pocket, just passing the time on a Black man's neck. After all, George was not human. You cannot hear the pleas of a non-human. You cannot respond to the life being sucked out of a non-human. You can kill him to obliterate breathing Blackness, speaking Blackness, thinking Blackness. The machine of white supremacy is so well oiled not to see or to hear or to feel. It is a cold and calculating gadget with one singular laser-focused objective: to kill me in the most comprehensive and thorough manner. Slowly through policy and infrastructure, or suddenly through the deprivation of oxygen. This machine, with its intricate screws ground into my ancestral body, this machine that has robbed Black people of our liberty and who profited by this theft every hour that we live, have no moral ground on which to stand. It is the humiliated, incarcerated, mutilated, and terrorized Black body that serves as the vestibule for this democratic republic. I love this country. And all my life, I have heard that it's going to take time for America to change. I believed it, and I worked for it. But I have a message to my own childish aspirations today from the Me Too movement. And that message is, time's up. How much time does it take to see us as human? How much time does it take for our pleas to be heard? You know, there's a great relief in saying time's up. It means that something else is going to happen. It means the end of something. It means now what? What it doesn't mean is hope for something better. It means actions for something better. We are witnessing a shocking accumulation of injured and mutilated Black bodies, particularly young Black bodies. Our Unitarian, Universalist, liberal, and progressive white communities need to ask themselves this question. If our movement is truly progressing towards this, quote, society that is to come, maybe, if we're really moving towards that, why is suffering increasing at such an alarming rate? In response to this inquiry, are you telling your Black siblings that they remain hopeful? Keep struggling? Keep hope alive? Keep faith? I have come to the conclusion that hope is a deadly aspiration for Black people. When we hope, we are still. Hope is a naive conundrum that doesn't inspire action. Being hopeful comes from a place of lack and scarcity. Hope causes us to wait for things to happen to us rather than going out and creating those things for ourselves. While we hope, we continue to suffer. America depends on Black people to wait and hope and pray so white supremacy can continue maintaining and adding to our suffering. My great-grandfather hoped, and he and my family taught that during the uprisings, taught me during the uprisings in 1968, that the political arithmetic of this country wants us to hope while it's saturated with violence. It was founded on looting in the Boston Harbor. It looted the land of the native folks. It looted the shores of Africa that brought me here. It looted the environment. It looted Black communities from their wealth. Thus, nonviolence is a misnomer or somewhat of a ruse. Hope is a Black sacrifice. It is a violence directed towards the self, and it is useless. Political hope has usurped the spiritual principle of hope and puts it in the service of extending oppression. The political hope is bound up with metaphysical violence, and this violence masquerades as a solution to the problem of anti-Blackness. This hopeful, temporal, linear perfection is connected to the tropes of betterment, struggle, work, and utopian multicultural futures. These conceptual instruments of political hope will never obliviate Black suffering or anti-Black violence. These concepts only serve to reproduce the conditions that render our existence unbearable. Political theologians and optimists avoid the immediacy of Black suffering, the horror of anti-Black pulverization, and paint pictures of the, quote, not yet but is, maybe to come soon, maybe the social order will be. Political hope becomes a vicious and abusive cycle of struggle. It's like putting a circle around an idea or an object. The idea might be Black freedom. It might be reparations. It might be justice or relief or reprieve or redress or equality. Putting a circle around that and then making it inaccessible because it doesn't really exist. Those with political hope propose a collective enjoyment as an answer to Black suffering. They point to finding the joy in the struggle, the victory in the toil, and the satisfaction of symbolic action, and the singing of songs from enslavement. How repulsive is it that in our very own hymnal, there is a song, "No More Auction Block for Me," white UUs singing about toil and struggle as Black youth are slaughtered daily. Black bodies are incarcerated as forms of capital. Black infant mortality rates are soaring, and hunger is disabling the bodies, minds, and spirits of desperate Black youth. These conditions are deep problems, and singing spirituals does not address the terrifying fact that the world depends on Black death to sustain white life. They depended on my ancestors' death, but I'm here to say time's up again. I'm here to say it for Richard Johnson, my great-grandfather, who said at the end of slavery was just a coffee break. And he went on to create numerous Black businesses, employed much of his community in good jobs. Time's up for Walter Grooms, my pop-up, who, like other Black soldiers, was a war runner across the battlefield who took messages from one battalion to another across explosive areas. He came home to be a union organizer at the Navy Yard. Time's up for Shirley Grooms, my mother, a social worker, and George Hutt, my father, an engineer and politician, who risked everything. They risked everything walking me one day across a racial barrier to enroll me into an all-white school that had the resources they believed I need for my education. My ancestors did not hope and wait. They acted and organized. Friends, go down and try for a day to see what it's like to let go of political hope. Just let it go. Imagine the creation of a spiritual, human, life-centered, life-giving hope that's rooted in the reality of the world we have now, not the one we dream of. Imagine the creation of a spiritual, human, life-centered, life-giving hope that will be built with the Black and white ashes that have been left on Lake Street. Imagine. Blessed be. Amen and Ashe.